Good morning. It is Tuesday, March the 29th, and this is The Drill. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. Today, after the daily declaration for spiritual warfare, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have worship, chapter 1 from the book, Our Bicentennial, or My Bicentennial Year. And we will also have there's no free lunch, and that's it. All that and more when I come back. Thank you. And now the daily declaration for spiritual warfare for March 29th. I will give you boldness to preach the gospel. My child, I have heard the cry of your heart and have seen your faithfulness to me. Therefore, I have answered your cry and have emboldened you to preach my word. I am sending you out to proclaim my gospel, heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, drive out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore, be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. In my name, you will drive out demons. You will speak in a new tongue. You will place your hands on sick people, and they will get well. I've caused my light to shine in your heart to give you the light of the knowledge of my glory. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 4 through 5. Matthew chapter 10, verse 16. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 6. Prayer declaration. Because I have been clothed in the righteousness of God himself, I have confidence and boldness to preach his word. I will be as bold as a lion and will make known the mystery of the gospel of God. I will preach and teach with a demonstration of the Spirit and of power. May the fire of God be in my tongue to preach and to prophecy. Amen. And that was the daily declaration for spiritual warfare for March 29th. Thank you. Who is the true conservative? He is religious and realistic. He is the person that understands that culture is the foundation for politics. He acknowledges a benevolent universe. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential. not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American. Thank you. What are the tactics in support of the strategy to rid America of socialist influence? The long-term tactics are to be a true conservative, talk like a conservative, act like a conservative, dress like a conservative, and think like a conservative. The short-term tactics are rhetorical. True conservatives need to win all of the arguments. That means don't prove a negative. Don't take their word for it. Don't be neutral, and ask plenty of questions. Thank you. What is the true conservative strategy for defeating socialists in this country? Socialists must be driven from positions of power, and since it is lefty counterculture that provides the foundation for their political success, true conservatives must resist left-wing counterculture and promote normal American culture. By changing our culture, we will change our politics. And by changing the culture, we mean you need to get married, have a family, and raise your children. Thank you. What are the true conservative political priorities? Number 1, the abolition of abortion throughout the land. Number 2, make nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons obsolete. Number 3, the immediate decertification of all public employee unions. Number 4, the immediate assignment of criminal and civil liabilities to all government regulators. Number 5, the immediate repeal of the so-called Patriot Act. Number 6, the immediate repeal of all emergency dictator laws. Number 7, the reinstatement of writs of outlawry. Number 8, government-sponsored recalls, ballot initiatives, and referendums. 9, a flexible minimum wage. And 10, means-tested health care. Thank you. Now, there's no free lunch. When I discuss the nature of value, I observed that value is nothing inherent in goods and that it is not a property of goods. But neither is value an independent thing. There's no reason why a good may not have value to one economizing individual, but no value to another individual under different circumstances. The measure of value is entirely subjective in nature, and for this reason a good can have great value to one economizing individual, little value to another, and no value at all to a third, depending upon the difference in their requirements and available amount. What one person disdains or values lightly is appreciated by another, and what one person abandons is often picked up by another." Unquote. Karl Menger. The subjective nature of value is philosophically non-negotiable for advocates of a free market economy. Once we have tied value to some objective standard, we have invited an undesirable to the process, the anointed arbiter of that objective value. Subjectivity in value is not only logical and cogent, but necessary to allow exchange to freely occur towards the betterment of all parties. And that was, there's no free lunch. Thank you. So I was thinking about something that was interesting, that it seems in our society today with so much atheism going on, so many people claiming to be atheists or agnostics, or they want to fudge it and say that they're spiritual instead of religious. And but they'll worship people. They didn't give up worship just because they became atheists. It's who they worship now that's fascinating. They'll worship the police departments. They'll worship the fire department. They'll worship the teachers. They will worship their own children. I remember on Rush Limbaugh, there was a guy that called, and his daughter was off to college, and she was learning all kinds of, things that were making her hate her parents, that white people are terrible and horrible, and they've created all kinds of problems in this society, etc. And the usual left-wing garbage. She's being indoctrinated. She's being brainwashed. And dad is afraid to say anything. He says, "Oh, but I love my daughter and I don't want to lose my relationship with my daughter." He worships his daughter. And I would have loved to have been able to ask him, "Do you go to church?" Actually, I've been loved to tell him, "Hey, you're worshiping your daughter. That's sick. It's twisted. It's wrong. And right now, if you die now, you're going straight to hell. You need to go to church. Go to mass. And as a matter of fact, go to confession and confess your sins, and then go to mass and start worshiping Jesus Christ." But it's fascinating. These lefties won't worship Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, but they'll worship their own children. How about that? Thank you. And now the conclusion of Chapter 5 of Shadowbosses. We have seen how teachers' unions control education policy and classroom content across America. As Michelle Malkin rightly observes, instead of incentivizing fixes, politicians, dependent on teachers' union campaign contributions and human shield photo ops, incentivize more failure. In the face of their huge organizational advantages, how can we possibly pull teachers' unions' tentacles out of our system of education? A critical first step toward reclaiming our K-12 schools is for taxpayers to pay attention to elections for the state superintendent of education and the local school board members. After all, many of these state and local government officials are elected with teachers' union help while we are not paying attention, and they significantly determine educational policy in our states and school districts. We need to elect government officials that truly represent the interests of families, children, and actual teachers, not just teachers' unions. A second line of attack is to hit teachers' unions where it really hurts: the dues income that they extract from teachers in forced dues states. Teachers, like all workers, should have a choice over whether or not to pay union dues, a choice that they don't have currently in the F-grade states. Also, states with dues checkoff arrangements should stop collecting union dues for teachers' unions, or any other unions for that matter. Dues are payments to private organizations, so why should the state collect them on the union's behalf? States also should require school districts to hold new elections to recertify the teachers' union on a regular basis. This would give teachers an actual vote on whether or not they want to have a union represent them, instead of sticking them with a union that was elected many years before by their predecessors. Elections are not useful or fair unless they're regular. Third, we should encourage our states to try innovative solutions in education that put our children's needs before those of the teachers' unions. Even if we don't have kids in the local school system, we all have skin in the game as taxpayers and citizens. Finally, we need to pay attention to what our children are being taught in their classrooms. Do we really agree with what is going on in the classroom and the lessons and values taught there? And if not, are we willing to stand up for what we believe in? If we don't rein in the teachers' unions soon, our nation and our children will continue paying a high price. And that was the conclusion of Chapter 5 of the book Shadowbosses about public employee unions. And Chapter 5 was called The Schoolhouse Shadowbosses. Next time we will start Chapter 6, Shadowbosses Bankrupt Our States. Thank you, thank you. And now, chapter 1 of the book, Tales from My Bicentennial Year, Baseball, Hot Dogs, Apple Pie, and a Plymouth Fury 3 by Michael Buell. This is a story about growing up in a small town in the 1970s. It's told from the perspective of a young boy, my son Mike. I am sure that if this story had been told from the point of view of the parents, it would have had a different outlook. Much the same can be said of life's moments. The child sees it one way, the parent another. It is our hope that the choices we made for our children help them make the right decisions in life. So far, they all have seemed to turn out okay. And now we are going to go to chapter 1, Who We Were. My mind keeps coming back to my younger days, the mid-70s, the era of banana seats, big wheels, the bicentennial, disco duck, the Olympics with Bruce Jenner, the Red Sox, and the Big Red Machine. And, of course, the summer Elvis died. Specifically, one enjoyable fun year for me, the fall of 1975 through the summer of 1976. This was the year that I grew from being a mere child to being a kid who knew everything. You know, the time in your life when nothing could hurt you. You were invincible, not a care in the world. This was the point in my life when my biggest worry of the day was where we were going to play baseball and who was going to be the first picked on each team. As I was looking at my kids sitting on the couch, my 10-year-old son and my 13-year-old daughter, I wondered if they were living the same carefree life we did. When I grew up, there were no play dates, no cell phones to text friends, no we, and no computers. Were our lives simpler? I think so. We weren't inside sitting on the couch playing video games. We were outside playing from right after breakfast until the dreaded yell to come in for the evening. Heck, my kids have to have schedules kept for them. I almost feel sorry for them. During school, they are on the go from early in the morning until after dinner. These days, you have to sign your kids up for everything. Music lessons, karate, dance, soccer, baseball, Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, band, choir practice, and of course, religion. Back in the olden days, you went to school and that was it. We took the bus in and the bus back. We had chores, believe it or not. Our parents actually expected us to help out around the house. Anyhow, when I look back at those golden days, I wonder how other kids who were not in our neighborhood or school or city or state grew up. Did they have the same rules, the same games, the same types of parents, the same amount of fun, learn the same lessons, worship Evel Knievel, watch Donnie and Marie on Saturday nights, even though they won't admit it now? I know not everyone lived like we did, but my guess is that no matter who reads this story, they will be able to relate, remember, and think fondly of how life was in 1975. We grew up in the Sticks in Gansevoort, New York. Gansevoort is actually named after a supposed great general in the Revolutionary War, Peter Gansevoort. If you've ever traveled to parts of New England or upstate New York, you will notice that every nook and cranny village is named after a famous Revolutionary War hero. Peter Gansevoort's mansion is right in the center of town, and it has now been documented that Herman Melville, his cousin, wrote parts of Moby Dick while visiting the mansion. Gansevoort is located about halfway between Lake George, setting for the Last of the Mohicans, and Saratoga, famous for the Battle of Saratoga, where Benedict Arnold, yes, the traitor, was the hero and savior of the Battle of Saratoga. Gansevoort is not only the foundation and setting for our stories, but also the foundation for my life. Back in a minute. Thank you, thank you. For the most part, our town in 1975 was filled with poor but hardworking people. The area, once you were off the main street, was absolutely beautiful. Thing is, when you're 10 years old, you don't notice the beauty and you don't realize how great you had it. We were located in the foothills of the Adirondack Mountains. We could swim the Hudson River, sleigh ride for miles down the side of the mountain foothills, take hikes and build forts in the never-ending woods. It was our paradise. It was all we knew. We had seen no better or no worse. To us, anything outside of our town might as well have been Paris, because we had about as good a shot at making it to Albany as we did to Paris. Gansevoort was basically defined by the road system, one road that crossed another with railroad tracks going through the middle. At the main corner of town was our church, the Gansevoort Market, the post office, the firehouse, all volunteer of course, the aforementioned Gansevoort Mansion, and the Gansevoort Hotel, which had been there about 4,000 years and was basically a rundown building that 702 different owners had tried to make a go of, but failed. Years ago, the town was a stopover from points north to points south, in the days before cars or road systems. There are many stories about its heyday, when Gansevoort was the grain capital of New York State. This is where the farmers from all around brought their harvest for distribution to points south and east. They would pile in on wagons, unload the harvest, make a deal with the distributor, and watch the grain get loaded up on the train. The grain capital is said to have two meanings: grain, as in grain harvests, and grain, as in the grain drinks consumed at the Gansevoort Hotel after the farmers sold the harvest to the distributor. Who knows for sure, but every small town has to have its stories. Our neighborhood was a mile or so from the center of town. We were in a 4-street development, smartly named 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Streets. The streets were carved from some property that was originally cow pastures and sold off by Bill Campbell. My dad calls him Bill the Mayor Campbell. Bill was the big farmer in a town of many small farmers. Bill, being a typical farmer, had a large family. 37 children, I heard. Heck, we all had large families. We had 6 kids. The Cinzanos had 6 kids. And it seems that everyone I knew had large families. Bill also had large cows, large daughters, large horses, large tractors, and large piles of manure. We were all downright scared of Big Bill. Why exactly, I'm not sure. We'd never met him. We'd seen him plenty of times, but never spoke to him. When we saw him, he was either riding the tractor or walking his fields, which, so you know, were surrounded by 12,000 volts of electric fences. Maybe we were afraid of him for the large sickle he always carried around while walking. His son, Chad, was our age, but he was bigger, meaner, smellier, tougher, busier, and heck, just seemed older than we were. So needless to say, he never hung out with us. Suffice it to say, the few times we did have a run-in with Chad, he won. I have since come to understand, appreciate, and respect Bill and his family. My dad says he is one of the most honest, helpful, decent, the type of guy who gives back to those who don't have, person that God ever made. The town in 1975 was just starting to become developed. Today, the village of Gansevoort has become a suburb of Saratoga, with the McMansion houses you never would have seen in 1975. Heck, we had a family of 6 kids that grew up in a 1-story ranch house with an exposed basement. We only had 1 bathroom for all of us. My kids today live in a house with 3 bathrooms for the 4 of us, and they still fight over the bathroom time and space. All the houses in the neighborhood were the same. Small, 1-story houses filled with large families. Good news for us was that there were always a ton of kids around to play baseball, football, you name it. There was always a game on. Today, we struggle to get our kids out of the house and away from cell phones and the laptop. Back in a minute. Thank you. Our line of streets was the first of many developments to come, but in 1975, that was it. Our little development was surrounded by cow pastures, farmland, and forests, which we called the Woods. It was a pretty naming convention the village used for the new four streets: 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Streets. 4th Street was our turf. Our arch rivals were the 3rd Streeters. We never really had any contact with the families on 1st and 2nd Street. All 4 streets teed into Cobar Road, which led back to the center of town. 4th Street was the farthest away from the center of town. Behind 4th Street, away from the town, was a hill that was a fenced-in cow pasture that went on forever. At the end of our street, away from Cobar Road, was a huge sand pit. The sand pit always seemed a little out of place to us, but there it was. Off to the right of the sand pit was a pond with a big old dead tree square in the middle of it. Behind and to the left of the sand pit was a forest that went on forever, and had a great ravine with a small creek at the bottom. Each street had 5 houses on each side, with about half an acre of land each. So between 3rd and 4th Streets, we had about 5 square acres of land to play on. This was all open land, as no trees had yet been planted. If you go there today, it looks like the Home Depot nursery gone awry on radiation. There was also a slight dip between 3rd and 4th Streets, which sometimes, if it rained a lot, filled up with water. So for a little while, you had a mini lake between the street backyards. Across from 4th Street, on the other side of Cobar Road, was all Farmer the Mayor Campbell's land. Way, way back, you could just barely see the main farmhouse and barn. The mayor's land was all fenced in with barbed wire, and in some spots, electric fences. We recognized the electric fence because it had white cones every 100 feet or so. Each morning his cows would leave the top part of his land and roam down all the way to Cobar Road right across the street from us. Then they would all bunch up and wait for Chad. Chad and some of the Campbell kids would walk down to the cows yelling, "Come boss, come boss, come bossy," and the cows would walk towards them. Chad would swing open the big gate onto Cobar Road and lead the cows across the street into the cow pasture on our side of Cobar Road. It was quite a sight watching the cow herd cross the street. They knew the drill and didn't try and run away when they had the chance. I always wondered why not one cow ever decided to make a break for it. Was life that grand in the herd? The pasture that Chad led them to started out as flat land, but after a few hundred feet sloped down for quite a ways, which made a nice sleigh riding hill for us in the winter. Let's give you a little rundown of who made up 4th Street. The first house on 4th Street was owned by the Snarks. At the time, they were a young married couple with no kids. They didn't bother us then, and we didn't bother them. Then came the Tidwells. The Tidwell boys were a key component of our gang. Mr. and Mrs. Tidwell, they wouldn't mind me saying this, were both a little on the heavy side. They had 3 sons. Gene was the oldest at 10, Brad was 9, and Brucey was 5. Gene was the brawn. Later in life he earned the nickname Huge Gene, and Brad was the brains. Next to them was the Barnardos. Gail and Dick were also a young married couple with 2 small daughters, Bernadette and Alicia, who were the same ages as my younger sisters Chris and Karen. The gang was in love with Gail, especially when she wore her ponytails, a tube top and a small cut-off shorts. Heck, at 10 years old, you don't know why you're looking at her like that. You just look. We lived on the side of the Bernardos. At this point in time, my folks, Jerry and Retta, had just 5 children. My sister Kathy, 12, me, 10, Chrissy, 8, Karen, 6, and Kevin, 5. All the kids in my family, in case you didn't notice it, have their names starting with a K. My name, on the other hand, started with an M. Coincidence or not, it made me feel special. I stood out. At the time, we considered my under 30-year-old parents to be extremely old. My parents insisted that we stay outside during the day, which was fine with us. Inside was off limits except for using the bathroom and meals. The last house on our side was occupied by a weird little family. No, they weren't midgets, but they were tiny, and they were weird. More on that to come. They were the Harveys, Mr. and Mrs., and believe it or not, they named their only son Lee, as in Lee Harvey Oswald. I've often wondered, were these people incredibly stupid or just outright mean? I'm hoping for Lee's sake they were just stupid. I mean, for God's sakes, who would name their son Lee Harvey? Lee was a small 8-year-old with a buzz cut and a giant black square-rimmed glasses the size of 2 Coke bottles. Lee was, and I'm sure still is, one of the nicest people you could meet. Across the street from Lee Harvey's house were the Cinzanos, another key contingent to the gang. They were Mr. and Mrs. Anna, 16, John, 14. He always tried to bully the gang. Actually, he didn't try, he did bully the gang. Brenda, 12, and Mike, 10. The Cinzanos, in case you could not guess from their name, were your typically loud Italian family. There was always sauce cooking on Sunday, and the whole family helped out with the cooking. When you went over the Cinzanos, you had better bring your earplugs. Their normal talking voice in the house was yelling to the rest of us. They all had to yell at each other for simple things, but that was how they were. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed the yelling because they always made you feel like you were part of the family, drawing you into the conversation, showing you how to make meatballs, etc. Back in a minute. Thank you. Next to the Cinzanos and across the street from us were the Garshamers. Why the Garshamers? The name we derived from their mailbox, on which they posted their 3 last names, Garmond, Shamet, and Merced. We did not understand that the missus had been married 3 times to 3 sets of kids. The kids were a little out there. Clyde, 14, Marissa, 12, Brittany, 11, Tommy, 10, and Tammy, 8. Tommy at one point threatened and screamed in the front of his yard to take a knife to his stepdad's throat. This scene lasted until the police arrived. Needless to say, it was quite a sight for us. I'm not sure what became of Tommy, but the Garshamers have remained across the street from my parents and are great neighbors. Up the street from the Garshamers and directly across from the Bernardos was the Wall family, Mr. and Mrs. Wall and their 2 lovely deranged youths, Annette, 8, and AJ, who was 7. They looked just like the Raggedy Ann and Andy dolls, and if you somehow can imagine, they acted like them too. The Walls had a real bully of an older cousin who stayed a few weeks each summer with them, Buddy. Raggedy Ann and Andy called him Uncle Buddy. Buddy just loved to hang with us. He would playfully throw firecrackers at us, twist our arms up our backs until we cried Uncle Buddy instead of just Uncle. We got the feeling that Buddy did not have the easiest life, and what better way to get back at life than to beat us up? The house by the Walls was the Williamsons, Mr. and Mrs. Williamson, along with Russ, 12, and Kim, 10. The Williamsons moved into the neighborhood after the gang had already formed. Russ's claim to fame was his dad's stack of old penthouses in the basement. The first time Russ showed us the stack, our eyes fell out of our heads. The girls in the magazine certainly didn't live in our neighborhood. It wasn't sure they were even real humans. Russ was generally a guy who tried to fit in, but never quite did. His father was never around, and his mother just seemed to be out of it. The last house was the Drenowitzes, Mr. and Mrs., with Billy, 12, and Frankie, 6. This was one messed up family and house. Our parents warned us never to go in their house, not that we were ever invited. The house was in a constant state of disrepair. The lawn was never mowed, junk in the backyard. The kids always wore the same clothes every day and were always dirty. Billy was one tough dude, though. You did not want to mess with him. I suppose, looking back on him now, he was tough and mean because he had to be. He really had no desire to hang with us. He had a bunch of kids he hung with called the Fritters. These guys were the local toughies who lived in the main part of the village, not the new developments we lived in. We did not mess with the Fritters. These folks made up our neighborhood. This was a time when the dads worked and mom's job was the kids. It was a place where everyone knew your name, knew when you were in trouble, knew when you should be in trouble, knew how to get you in trouble, and knew the same about them. From our perspective, the other moms knew what time we ate dinner, who was allergic to what, And heck, probably even knew how many pairs of underwear I owned. Most importantly, we knew that we needed to treat each mom with respect. Not only were they allowed to yell at you just as bad as your own mom, they would, after yelling at you, call, or better yet, run across the street and tell your mom what you had done, giving your mom the ammunition to yell at you some more. If one kid in our gang got in trouble, it usually meant that all of us were in trouble. The yelling would spread across the neighborhood like an invisible virus, infecting one kid and then the next. And that is the first part of Chapter 1 of My Bicentennial Year. And next time we will have Part 2. Thank you. On second thought, I'm going to go ahead and finish Chapter 1. To give a for instance, late in the summer of 1975, we were playing in the woods. This, if you remember, was right at the end of the street, just past the sand pit. The woods were our refuge. Each group of kids would build their own fort. One kind of fort was located under a big bush that kind of gave a canopy effect. You entered by crawling through the branches and voila, you were in a room with branches in the middle of it, and leaves for your walls and roof. An old blanket made up the floor. This type of fort was usually the domain of the smaller kids. The best kind of fort was a tree fort. Not necessarily a fort up in a tree. The fort used for 4 smaller trees for the corners of the fort. The hard part was finding 4 trees that were already in place in a general square or rectangular shape. We would begin cutting down smaller trees and nailing them up across the 4 standing trees to make the walls. For a couple of days, we had been building the best and biggest fort ever. Mike, Gene, Brand, myself, and Russ had been gathering, stealing might be a better word, tools, nails, pieces of wood, carpet remnants, and anything else we could find that would help us build the fort. Russ's big contribution was the September 1970 edition of Penthouse. In the woods, there was a big ravine right down the center. At the bottom of the ravine was a small creek. The sides were all covered with trees where we made a bunch of trails. Once you were able to climb up the steep sides from the creek, the land leveled out on both sides. We chose a piece of land on the other side of the ravine, which was flat, but up pretty high on the rock outcrop. It gave us a pretty good view of the entire woods back up to the sand pit. It was also far enough away from the main entrance to the woods that the smaller kids would not follow us. After a few days of sawing, nailing, and fighting over who the foreman was, we somehow managed to get the 4 walls up. Gene even managed to get an old screen door from his basement. The only thing missing was a roof. We debated for a while as to the best way to build the roof. We all agreed that we needed one. Did we find some big sheets of plywood and lay them across? Mike suggested that we make it watertight by stretching out some garbage bags like shingles. Brad finally had what seemed to be the best and easiest idea. The simplest thing to do is cut down some small pine trees and branches, tie them to the cross beams we had already set up, and keep layering them on so that the pine needles on the branches became the roof and would at least keep the sun out and might just keep water out unless it rained real hard. We agreed this was the best choice. One problem we had was that we only had one small axe that we'd been using for the smaller trees we had been cutting down. We needed at least one more axe or this project would take forever. We figured you needed 2 people cutting the branches and dropping them down, 2 people hauling back, and 2 people tying them to the big branches on the roof. Russ had seen an extra axe in the back of the Walls yard behind their shed. We figured that if we asked to borrow it, the answer would most certainly be a no. So we better just borrow the axe and return it when we were done. It was decided that an expedition needed to be carried out to borrow the axe, so we drew up the plan. Russ's yard was right next to Mr. Wall's. Problem was the chain link fence between the yards. At the time, we felt that Mrs. Wall was kind of uppity to have a fenced-in yard. In hindsight, She should have built it taller. We would assume the playful picture of just some happy kids throwing the baseball in Russ's backyard. At the appropriate time, when Mrs. Wall and the Raggedy Ann children went in for lunch, I would throw the ball over the fence into the backyard in the vicinity of the axe. Gene, he was chosen because he was the tallest and therefore most likely to accomplish the mission, would hop the fence, grab the axe, which was laying up against the shed, run the axe to the very back of the yard, which bordered the cornfield, and throw the axe into the field. It would then be easy to recover the ball, and even if he was seen, he had a handy-dandy just getting the ball excuse for being in the backyard. Simple plan, or so we thought. We started playing catch, each of us all bunched up alongside the fence. The Walls just kept playing on their swing set. They would not leave. Then we even had Raggedy Ann come over to us asking a lot of questions. Finally, Mrs. Wall called them in for lunch. After waiting a while, in reality about 30 seconds because we all wanted this over, I threw the ball towards the shed with the axe lying up against the wall. It did not, however, go to the projected target. It did go like a missile right into the side of the metal shed. Crack! A sound like lightning and thunder as the ball hit the shed, the sound reverberating throughout the entire neighborhood. Mrs. Wall came running out in the backyard with Raggedy Ann and Andy in close pursuit, her loud shrieking voice yelling at, "What are you all doing?" She came out in a rush, just as Gene was hopping the fence. Now, we had been warned numerous times not to hop the fence. Mr. Wall thought he had damaged it earlier this summer in a botched effort to borrow their dog. Long story. Gene was in midair, just throwing his first leg over the fence when the shrieking Mrs. Wall came out. Gene instantly looked up at Mrs. Wall while he tried to stop his momentum, dropped straight down, one leg on each side of the fence. He grabbed his crotch, doubled over, and fell, head first off the fence into the Wall's yard. A blood-curdling scream came out of his mouth, followed by these now infamous words, "My balls are broke." Like all good supporting friends, we immediately ran away, scattering among the cornfields behind the Wall's house, leaving a shaken Gene to answer to Mrs. Wall why he was hopping the fence. From our spots lying down in the cornfield, we observed Mrs. Hall run over to Gene and check him out. Seeing that Gene was alive, she sent Raggedy Ann and Andy over to get Mrs. Tidwell, who was already alerted that trouble was in the air due to the loud noise on the shed. Was in the Wall's backyard in about 2 seconds. For a heavy girl, she sure could move when properly motivated. The interrogation of Gene was about to begin. Mrs. Tidwell walked over to Gene, grabbed him by the ear, and proceeded with the interrogation. Mrs. Tidwell, "Are you okay or are your balls still broke?" she asked sarcastically. Gene, "No," sniffle, sniffle, he whined while he was still clutching his crotch. Mrs. Tidwell, "Why were you on the fence? You know you should not be in the Wall's yard." Gene's answer should have been because we lost the ball over the fence and they were in for lunch, so I was just hopping the wall fence to get the ball. If he had said that, everything would have been fine. But no. Gene answered with one word only, axe. Mrs. Tidwell, "What do you mean? What on earth would be doing with an axe?" Gene, "We were going to borrow the axe to cut down some trees." Mrs. Tidwell, "Why would you be doing that?" Gene, "To make a roof on our fort." Earlier this summer, there was a big fort disaster, and the girls' fort had collapsed, severely injuring several girls. A couple of small cuts all survived. After this, the town fort inspectors, our moms, made a surprise inspection of all existing forts. New rules were put in place, strictly banning roofs of any kind. No exceptions. Mrs. Tidwell, "I thought we banned roofs." Mrs. Wall, "Didn't we ban roofs?" Mrs. Wall, "Oh, yes, Nancy, we sure did. And don't forget that they were trying to steal my husband's axe," she added. Mrs. Tidwell, "Yeah, right, the axe." Mrs. Tidwell, and just where all the other boys, get out here now," she yelled. Now, there are certain levels of yells that require different levels of action. This was a yell that required immediate action. We all came out of our hiding places in the cornfield and stood in line for punishment. It was like a small chain gang procession for small boys. I even think Mike Cinzano was singing like the men working on the chain gang. By this time, the entire mom police were out. circling the action, interviewing witnesses, drawing chalk lines around where Jean had fallen. The mom police also have the benefit of quickly turning into the mom judge and jury, able to hear the evidence and render a judgment in the case in a matter of minutes. When the gavel came down, it was actually Nancy Tidwell's large fist bonking Jean on the top of the head. We had been found guilty of roof building without a permit, trespassing, and attempting to steal an axe. What had started as a glorious day of fort building was now over. We're now in the chain gang line waiting for sentencing and punishment. We were told to form a single line in the hot noontime sun. We were ordered on a baton-like death march back into the woods. The mom panel of judge and jury had now transformed into the mom prison guards. This procession was also followed with the smaller kids in the neighborhood trolling afterwards, kicking rocks at us. Even Raggedy Ann and Andy were joining in the fun. My mom was the head prison guard. She marched into the woods through our trails. No time for a water break. Down the ravine, across the creek, and up the other side of the ravine. The moms holding onto tree branches as they climbed up. "Don't think we can't make it up," Mrs. Chinzano said. At last we reached the top plateau. There stood our masterfully engineered fort with branches, logs, half sheets of old plywood, rope, and old screen door, all assembled in front of us all. The orders were given. We were to dismantle the fort, and we were then banned from the woods for 1 week. We ripped down the timbers, took off the plywood, untied the rope, and unscrewed the front door as our guards watched. After the demolition, we were all marched back up to the neighborhood. I was silently singing, "Listen to What the Man Said," as I was trying to remember why this was happening. It could not possibly be our fault. This was certainly unfair treatment. And that was chapter 1 of the book, My Bicentennial Year. Thank you, thank you. Who is the socialist? He is the man that is spiritual. He's the man that seeks consensus. He's subjective, petty, and small, taking everything in life personally. He's outrageous, boring, and rude. He pretends to be a leader and a change agent. He pretends that he's your friend. He is sly, cunning, and deceptive. He dresses, acts, and speaks like a slob. He is informal and terminally unique. He is childish and pretends that he knows nothing. He has no conscience and pretends that might makes right and that the ends justify the means. He is impulsive and rationalizes his behavior. He is deterministic, blaming others for his mistakes. He is skeptical, demanding that others solve his problems. His unreasonableness and irresponsibility make him a bad role model, bad father, brother, family member, friend, and a bad person, period. So if you think that you can be friends with a socialist, think again. Thank you, thank you. Thank you, thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to tune in to the John and Ken Show, which is an excellent example of how true conservatives communicate. It's a radio show that's on KFI AM 640 from 2 o'clock in the afternoon to 6 o'clock in the evening, Monday through Friday. And that's Pacific time. So that's an excellent show to listen to. And other than that, until next time, remember to be honest, to be smart, to be beautiful, and to remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.